Good morning, St. John's. This is another special edition of Between Two Services. This is our second episode where we're looking at St. John's connection to slavery as part of our 175th anniversary, as part of our ongoing work for anti-racism and racial reconciliation within the parish. And also, as a sign of I think, the integrity of our witness, that we are a parish that not only wants to lift up the good and the best and the glorious parts of our history for the community, but are also willing, frankly, to look into parts that are more uncomfortable, that make us question, that are going to lead to some sort of examination. And that's, I think, a good thing. So today I'm joined by Mary Catherine and by Deacon Emily, and we're going to continue the conversation that we started with Ann Iverson last week. We're going to take a break next week for the Kirkin. I thought that was good. Kirkin's big enough. We don't need it between two services on Kirkin Sunday. But then I do want to follow up the following week with an episode really to start moving us in the direction of, okay, so what now? And I would invite, I've reached out to Sacred Ground alumni. I've reached out to members of the 175th Committee, and I've reached out to members of the pastoral care team. And I'm going to reach out to the whole parish and say, if you want to be part of that third episode, if you want to share a prayer, a reflection, history, some context that you think that was missing in the first two episodes, by all means, I'm always looking for collaborators in this program. And I also want to say, if you want to share some constructive feedback or constructive criticism, by all means, we can include that as well. We don't shy away from the truth here on Between Two Services, and we don't shy away from it at St. John's. So, all right, that's probably enough for me to get us started. I would really like to invite Mary Catherine to kind of take us away here, because we've been in conversation and you've talked about a little bit about some family history and your own work with that. So could you share what you feel comfortable with?
Sure, happy to. Thank you, Father Dana. So some of this had come out in some of our Sacred Ground circles, and I think Deacon Emily thought it would be useful. So I'm happy to share. Just to give you a quick little bit of background, I was raised by people who were raised in the South and grew up with the whole lost cause mentality, and was raised to admire my great-grandfather who fought for the Confederacy. I also had three great-grandfathers who fought for the Union, but I was told politely we didn't talk about them.
Ooh.
Yeah, but like many people, when I hit my 50s, I started to become much more interested in genealogy, and had the benefit of Ancestry.com and DNA tests. But my grandmother, long before the benefits of Ancestry, was very interested in genealogy and did a great deal of research on our family tree. And because nobody in my family ever throws anything away, I have a whole lot of paper records of things. So she became, I believe in the 1920s and 30s, it became really popular to become a member of the Daughters of the American Revolution, and you had to do a lot of research on your family tree. So she did it the old-fashioned way. She kept paper charts and wrote letters to court clerks in counties in Virginia, asking for transcriptions of wills of our various ancestors. And as I was plugging all of this stuff into Ancestry, And I ran across some of these original documents, which have been in my family my whole life, but had never actually come through and read. So most of these were prepared by county clerks in the late 1920s and early 1930s, and sent in the mail to my grandmother. And they're typed on this onion skin paper. If I were better prepared, I might have been able to scan these documents in, but they're kind of fragile. And so I'm just going to read some things to you. So why she was interested in wills is because it sometimes gives you a date of birth. They're usually prepared fairly close to a date of death. And the person making the will lists the complete names of all of their children and their wife. And, if there were children from any previous wives, etc. So it's very, very useful for that. And then they get very specific about who they're leaving to what, or what, who, let's say who they're leaving to whom. So I've got several wills here. I want to share some excerpts with you, and I've prepared them in kind of in order to kind of ease you into how this works. So the first one is from the will of my fifth great-grandfather, Colonel Joshua Fry, who died in 1754. All of these, by the way, all of these men lived in Central Virginia, somewhere between Charlottesville and Richmond, in about probably 150-mile radius. So Joshua Fry, they always start out bequeathing various pieces of land. And the second paragraph, he says, I give all my slaves to be equally divided among my children, John, Henry, William, Martha, and Margaret Fry. The slaves and their increase after my wife's death. But if she dies before him, the slaves and their increase get divided to the children without her part. So that one's actually fairly innocuous. I have the will of my fifth great-grandfather, Edward Scott, who died in 1738. And he's obviously a very devout man. He starts off his will saying, first and principally, I commend my soul into the hands of Almighty God, hoping through the merits, death, and passion of my Savior Jesus Christ to have full and free pardon and forgiveness for all my sins, and to inherit everlasting life, and my body commit to the earth to be decently buried, etc. Further down on his second page, after he bequeaths all of his 300 acres here and 400 acres there, he says, I give and bequeath all my Negroes except two I agreed to let to Stephen Pankey, to have equally divided between my wife and my two sons, share and share alike, and that they shall not be divided till such time as my two sons shall arrive at the full age of 24 years. I was thinking, oh, he's going to keep them together. And that the crops should be accordingly shared to that time. So he's keeping them all together so they can continue to bring in the crops. Yeah. So my sixth great-grandfather, John Scott, died in 1798. And he starts to get really specific. And this kind of will is a real gold mine to researchers, because it gets very specific with names and even just a little bit of genealogy of slaves. So he is talking about all the things he is going to leave to his wife, Margaret. And he talks about houses and various cattle. And then he says, the following slaves, to wit, Robin, Tina, alias Ursula, alias is somebody's name, Ursula, Molly, the cook, Molly, and then the cook of choice out of my whole estate of 10 others. that's to his wife. Then to his son, John, he lists some specific lands. And then he says the following slaves, to wit, Bouye, Charles, Abram, Annika, Tab, Suki, Billy, James, and Fanny. Together with their future increase, so that's them and their children. And then he goes on to his daughter, to daughter Frances and her heirs, I give and bequeath 2 Negro girls, China and Amy, and in the same sentence, and 2 mares called Medley and White Stockings. So the 2 Negro girls and these 2 mares, for her immediate use, together with their future increase, the increase of both China and Amy and the mares, and also $4,660. He goes on to dispose of some other property, and he says, the residue of my slaves, not herein otherwise disposed of, I give to my 4 sons, Edward, Charles, Samuel, and Daniel, and their heirs, to be equally divided among them. So they can just, if somebody wasn't specifically named, then
They're up for grabs.
they just get divided up.
Yeah, and so that's dividing families potentially. That's breaking up communities. That
Right.
human beings, it's like in the same breath, horses and women, and then almost as an afterthought. And by the way, if I haven't disposed of other people, here's what I want you to do with them, what I want done to them. And that's wow.
Right. I'll warn you, it gets worse.
Oh yeah.
Okay. So my 3rd great uncle, Daniel Scott, died in 1851. And he didn't have any children. So he left everything to his nephew, Charles, who was one of my direct ancestors. So he's giving him everything: household, kitchen furniture, all the slaves, horses, cattle, and stock of every description, carriages, growing crops, etc., etc. He lists a few other things to specifics, and then he says, I give to my niece, Martha Woods, 1 choice grown servant, or 2 small ones, 8 or 10 years, as she may prefer. So she gets her choice of either an adult or 2 smalls, as he refers to them.
It's interesting.
I've got 3 more if you've got the stomach for it. They're specifically chosen.
I just note that the euphemism servant.
Yes, sometimes they're referred to as slaves, sometimes they're referred to as servants, and sometimes they're referred to as Negroes. And as I had mentioned to you, I have a diary that my great grandmother kept in the mid 1800s, and she always referred to her slaves as the servants. So there may be some historians who may be able to point out that if they're specifically referred to as servant, but if they were a free person, they're not being left in a will, are they?
Right. If they're free
So,
person, they're not.
yeah. So those are all euphemisms for slaves. So my 5th great grandfather, Charles Lewis, died in 1782. And after he disposes of all his land, he says, I give to my daughter, Mildred Lewis, my Negro girl, Amy, daughter of mulatto Lucy. This is the first time I've seen a genealogy. And my Negro girl, Hannah, daughter of Tamor, and also 750 ounces of silver. Then he gets really specific. I give to my grandson, Howell Lewis, my Negro boy, Bob, son of Cato, and to my granddaughter, Sally Elizabeth Wills Lewis, my Negro girl, Lucinda, daughter of Pat. I give to my grandsons, John Henderson, Randolph Lewis, and Charles Lewis Thomas, a Negro boy. Here's where it gets really hard. A Negro boy between the ages of 4 and 7 years. That is to say, one such to each of them severally, and to my granddaughters, and he's got 4 granddaughters, a Negro girl between the ages of 4 and 7 years. That is to say, one such to each of them severally, which boys and girls bequeathed in this legacy are to be taken out of my estate. So what that says to me is at the time he makes this will, he doesn't know how many children they will be. So he's basically, I don't know if, this is very hard for me to imagine. I don't know if they just lined them all up and lined the heirs up, and was it like choosing sides for basketball?
Yeah.
And I don't mean to be the least bit flippant about that, because this is kind of how, it's that or go be sick to my stomach.
Right.
Right.
And this particular will, he names as the executor of his will, his friend Thomas Jefferson. Little historical note there. So while we're digesting that, here is another one of these choosing things. Charles Lewis was my 6th great-grandfather. He died in 1779. And he says, "It is my desire and will that after my wife's decease, that my son Howell should have first choice of all my Negroes, and that my son Robert should have his second choice of all my Negroes. And then after that, they go back and forth, choosing, again, like choosing sides for basketball. And that there should be 7 of my youngest Negroes, which kind of gives you an idea of how many he might have had total. 7 of the youngest to be set aside, and to my son John to give 3, to my son Charles 2, and to my son Howell 1, and my son Robert 1, that I do in order to make the number of the shares to those sons equal to what I give to his son James in his lifetime, who evidently predeceased them. That the division of the said 7 slaves among my said sons I devise may be made by their drawing the names of the said slaves by lot, or otherwise as they may decide. So yeah, here's where we're talking about dividing up families. I think the saddest thing on the plantation would be when the master died.
Right.
Right.
Because that's when they know everybody is going their separate ways. So this is the last one I'm going to burden you with. It's from my 5th great-grandfather, John Hudson. And the first thing in his will, again, I give my soul to God, beseeching his acceptance thereof through the merits of Jesus Christ, my Savior, and my body to the earth to be decently buried. He gives to his daughter, Mary Gaines, 5 Negroes named Betty, Judith, Anarchy, Caldy, and Little Anarchy, and their increase to her and her heirs forever.
Oh.
That's the first time I had seen that phrase, to her and her heirs forever. He gives to his daughter, Anna Hudson, 5 Negroes named Paul, Patience, Moll, George, and Peggott, and their increase, and 1 horse saddle and bridle, and 1 bed and furniture to her and her heirs forever. Again, I positively order that all the Negroes, which I will be possessed of at my decease, be kept together till they, by their crops, clear all the charge which may come against my estate. So in other words, let them keep harvesting the crops until all my estate's debts are paid. What I haven't researched is any slave schedules. I'd be really interested to see for John Hudson, because the list of names goes on and on and on, how many he might totally have. In the wills that I'm in possession of, I could probably count up of people either individually named with names or named by number. There's probably at least 100 that I know of. So there's a lot of weight to that. And through Sacred Ground, I'm aware of at least one organization that is a group for descendants of slave owners to help process this through writing. And it actually connects people like me with descendants of slaves that there's some kind of a family connection with. That seems like it could be a really effective healing type of thing. It's one of the many, many, many things I hope to do when I retire. But I'm also interested in researching the enslaved people that lived here on our farm, on Winter's farm. And I'm there is what I always grew up being told was the slave house, the quarters behind the main house. And I know that there's a particular plantation in Louisville that has been a really, I've read some interviews with descendants of some people that were enslaved there who have visited and found it to be a really healing thing. So I think a lot about how I might be able to turn any of this into a positive for any of the descendants of these people. But as Canon Stephanie says, I have to sit, there's a lot of sitting with this to be done.
Yeah, I'm so, I'm thankful for the work that you've done and for being willing to share this with us. Whether we share this or not, whether we keep it a deep, dark secret or not, whether we remain oblivious or not, it's still there. And that which goes unprocessed, that we don't sit with, still perpetuates and continues injustice, and even to present day, right? Like, yeah.
I'm curious, Mary Catherine, have you had much resistance from your family looking into large family, or has everybody been supportive and interested in what you're learning?
Well, I have shared it with some of my younger family members, and they're not, some of them have done some of the work, some of them haven't done any of the work. And so, it feels like some seed falls on fertile ground and some falls on the rocks. And, and there are some family members who I know, who I would anticipate would say, well, none of this was the least bit unusual. These were people of their time. You can't blame them. And, we weren't raised rich as a result of this. White privilege totally aside.
Right.
So the reaction is quite varied. Like a lot of things, I wish some younger family members might take a little more seriously, but they're not ready.
Right.
But that doesn't mean I can't help them.
Certainly, certainly. I'd say you're planting a lot of good seeds.
I'm trying.
Would you have looked into that, do you think, as quickly if you had not done Sacred Ground? Okay.
Absolutely not. I think I had read over these maybe years ago. Yeah, Sacred Ground has caused me to look at genealogy and ancestry in a totally different way. I have a ribbon, a pin with a ribbon on it that belonged to my grandmother. She was the chapter president of her chapter of the Daughters of American Revolution. And on this ribbon, there are gold, little gold flags that have the names of the 7 ancestors that we have that fought in the American Revolution. And I have kept that pin to a lamp on my dressing table for probably 20 years. And the way I feel about that pin has changes every year, okay. I will say. And Sacred Grounds had a lot to do with that.
I think that's a good plug for, the ongoing work and resources that our church has made available for definitely Sacred Ground. One of the concerns that's been, raised about our research project has been, the parish isn't prepared for this. And, there might be people who encounter this information and are wholly unprepared. But I would encourage people that if you have a strong reaction to the history of slavery within your parish, much less your family, I mean, like you're even going deeper and more personal, Mary Catherine, than even the work that we're doing here to kind of look at St. John's history of slavery. But this is a good opportunity for people. It's sort of like you come to a fork in the road, and you can choose to go one of two ways. You can either ignore it, discount it, shut it down, get angry about it, or you can grieve through it and work through it and research it and come to a point where you start thinking, okay, what next? As you have, like you lifted up, when I'm in retirement, I'd like to do this. There's this organization I found, I'd be interested in doing this. You didn't leap to those immediately. They're sort of, you're still working through them for future goals. And that might be where we are as a parish. Like the idea isn't to present this information and then say, well, immediately we need to do we need to, rip down plaques or do some kind of knee-jerk reaction. The purpose of the truth is so that we can begin to process it and look deeper. And I would encourage anyone who has found this information really disturbing to do exactly what you've done, Mary Catherine. Go into Sacred Ground, look into organizations, look into the history, and really start, like, don't turn away just because it's unpleasant, but instead delve deeper. And really, I think this is an act of faith, right? Because I'm gonna go a little preachy here, so forgive me. But every Sunday we get together and we do confession and forgiveness, right? Like, here's the thing. Jesus Christ didn't get crucified because someone was like impolite. He got crucified for the sake of the sins of the whole world that are like real sins, huge sins, the small sins along with them, but the actual, and so it's sort of like, if we who are people of faith, who believe that we truly are redeemed by Christ, can't look the sinfulness of our legacy and our history square in the eye and trust that on some level God is going to make this right, even if we can't, and that we're forgiven even if it's unforgivable. Um, if we don't have that kind of courage on account of Christ, then have we really truly ever heard the gospel? Now it gets challenged by, I think what you said is obviously these people in their wills are testifying to that same saving faith that I just mentioned, right? And so that complicates it too, as you sort of say, well, obviously they were commending their souls, and the merits of Christ and all of that, and they had this real gaping hole in their moral vision. I don't know what we do with that.
Yeah, they didn't evidently saw no disconnect there. I think I have, Emily, you were asking about, how I've approached this with my broader family and family members. And I personally have found over the years that, at least for me, a drip, drip, drip approach is more effective in the long run in changing hearts and minds. And I've seen that to be true at work and with lots of different things, including politics. And so, yeah, for people in the parish who have never confronted any of this, there are certainly going to be some people who'll be put off by it.
Yeah.
And who say, this is just bowing to political correctness, and it's ridiculous to judge these people by the standards of our time. But we just got to do the work, and that's going to take months and years, and it's probably never going to be completely done. But for us as a parish, to have the courage to start down that road and keep going on it, I think, I just don't see how we can have any credibility without it.
Right. Well, and I think that, that's always, it's weird because, like, basic Christianity, in weakness there's strength, in vulnerability there's strength, in suffering there's redemption, and to me, I can't help but look at the fact that, like, we lifted up the Queen Elizabeth story. I mean, it was a front page article in the Lexington Herald Leader. It was front page in the Woodford Sun, and that was good. And I think lifting that up is good, and that's a good part of our history. But it didn't really move the needle. It wasn't like the next Sunday 20 people were really interested in coming to the Queen's Church in Kentucky. And part of me wonders, in a world that's so full of hypocrisy and so full of just spin, if maybe being a church that tells the truth about some of this stuff won't actually be more authentic, and a church that can be vulnerable. And we talk about this all the time, like, why can't we get young people? Why can't we get more diversity? Well, I don't know what the answers to that are necessarily, but I know the fact that, there's a giant stained glass window dedicated in our church to someone who was instrumental in the foundation of our church, and without whom there would be no St. John's, but B, was also a slaveholder, right? Like, and I think the thing is if we're going to tell story A, we have to tell story B. And maybe if people realize, hey, this is going to be a church that will tell the full truth, that's a place where I'm comfortable investing myself spiritually, versus, oh, well, we're famous and we have, this celebrity visited, and the Queen and the president and Happy Chandler and, a lot of other people. We're also,
it would be nice to be known more for the church that follows Christ.
It would be nice
in all things,
including the uncomfortable work,
including the uncomfortable, yes,
of looking into the legacies of this stuff. And one of the things in this last week, since we filmed with Ian, is, you know, how much history there is just at St. John's. And I could share some of that with you all today, if you'd like, Mary Catherine, if you've got some time and some interest.
I'm not going anywhere.
All right. So I've been digging through some parish records that we have at St. John's, and just looking at some things in addition to what Ian has found. And I'll say, as a caveat from the very beginning, I don't have a PhD in history, but this is kind of some of the things that I've found. One of them is, I should be sharing here, these are the ground plans for the first rectory that St. John's built. And it was building it in 1863, so the Civil War was still ongoing. But one of the things that I really thought about when you were talking, Mary Catherine, is if you look up here in the upper story, right above the kitchen, right? Like in the part of the house you either definitely didn't want to be in the middle of summer, or maybe, you know, someplace you might want to be in the middle of winter. I don't know, but it's a half-story room, and it's the servants' room right there on the plans for the first rectory for St. John's, which to me suggests that when these plans were made, it was quite likely that, you know, previous rectors had slaves. We've not found any slaves we haven't found any evidence of slave ownership by the Venable family, but we know that the rectors that served, or at least one rector who served St. John's before Venable, was a slave owner, and it looked like at least they were opening up to the possibility that there would be servants living in the rectory. Things, but if you look at our baptismal records, this is the first page from St. John's registry book. So I've got the registry book right here, and it's old and delicate. So I took some photographs, and you work through this. So that these are the 14th through 24th people ever baptized at St. John's. And it looks like there was a group baptism on January 13th of 1855. And at that point, you can see we've got Lydia Ann Johnson, Frank Johnson, who are identified as a colored adult and a colored adult. And then we've got Robert Crane, John Crane, Mary Catherine Johnson, Charles Johnson, William Johnson, Jacob Vance, George Vance, and Emily Ann Vance, all identified as colored children. And then there's this note, and it's this note, I think, that's somewhat crazy to me. The colored persons here recorded belong to the estate of Mrs. Sarah F. Gaines, a member of St. John's Church.
What year was that, Father Dana?
This is 1855. They were all baptized in January of 1855.
It's also very interesting. They all have first and last names.
It is. So there's a story here, right?
Yeah.
There is a story here. And
yeah, were they freed on her death?
Were they freed on her death? What happened? She obviously desired that they be baptized, and she's recorded as a sponsor for all of their baptisms. Now, so let me share this. This is from the communicant members in the book. So here are the communicants. It starts with from 1847, and the first members of the parish listed Dr. Edward Griffith and Mrs. Henrietta Griffith. Without these two members and the Amstons, it really was the Amstons and the Griffiths that contributed the money to start St. John's. Without them, we really wouldn't have had a parish, which is one of the reasons why they're listed first in here. Dr. Edward Griffith was a slaveholder, according to the research I did. It wasn't from Ian's research, but I looked up his name in the slave schedule for Woodford County, and he did come up as a slaveholder. There's also here, you can see Mrs. Sarah F. Gaines, and it was her estate. She was admitted as a communicant member, was one of the first 3 people to be baptized. I'm not baptized, one of the first 3 people to be confirmed at St. John's. And here she is. And this is all from 1854. You can't see it. It got cut off when I took the photo. But she said it died in Versailles, October 27th, aged 87, buried in family burial ground in Woodford County. So Sarah F. Gaines was included on the slave schedules for Woodford County. Let me pop that up. So you see here she is, and here's a list of her slaves. And their ages: 40, 10, 9, 4, 3. And so the idea that she would have children in her estate is obviously confirmed. It looks like there's 3 3-year-olds here and a 13-year-old, and so this slave schedule entry seems to correlate pretty strongly. Although it is crazy too, because you think about breaking up families. One of the things that I've noticed comparing the 1850 slave schedule to the 1860 is how much the numbers actually change. And, people who owned X number of slaves 10 years later owned Y number of slaves. So obviously there was some movement within families, perhaps selling or other, and then of course, enslaved people would also pass away. But there's a lot of movement between the 1850 schedules and the 1860 schedules. But here it is, and here, she does have, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 people a few years earlier who would have been children, and then a couple of adults as well. So there's no names on the slave schedule. So this could very well be the people who are named on our baptismal record. One of the reasons why this is significant, other than the fact that these are baptized members of the church, I mean, these people are our sisters and brothers in Christ.
Brothers and sisters in Christ.
And they're on our books. How the particulars of how they got there are interesting, but the fact of the matter is they're there. They're members of St. John's. They're some of the original baptized members of St. John's, and so this is part of our story. And this is also significant too when we start thinking about how this continues to impact us. Let me share this screen. In 1856, she gives a rather large bequest for the support of the rector, from Mrs. Sarah F. Gaines in the amount of $500. This is one of the largest gifts given in the first decade of St. John's history. And it's a bequest from her, presumably from her estate. So this is one of the reasons why her will, if we could track it down, would be very interested, because it allows us to kind of examine, what happened. We know that she's on the slave schedule. So finding out what happened to those people that she enslaved would be interested to find out if they, because we have their names, and if they're named in her will, we would be able to track down sort of what happened to them. What, were they freed at her death? Were they not? All of that would be a story that we could tell, and it's our story. I mean, we're talking about like what happened to members of our parish here.
Yeah.
And then also to tell the story of the wealth of slaveholding. $500 in the context of the 1850s was a huge, huge, huge amount of money. And that, so for instance, if we go looking through the records, we have vestry minutes, and so the annual meeting of the vestry of St. John's Church. I love that it's the annual meeting of the vestry, like literally.
They met once a year.
We only met a couple of times a year. Someone on the vestry is thinking,
They got off easy. Yeah.
But on motion of H.H. Culbertson, it was unanimously resolved that Reverend J.W. Venable be called to officiate for the church 1 year at the salary of $450. So a year after this, the church receives the bequest from Mrs. Gaines's estate, and that amount is larger than the annual salary of the first rector.
Yes.
And so, I mean, this is significant.
Yeah.
And I think it's one of the things that really makes me want to see, can we track down that record? Because I mean, again, this is all part of our parish history, and I'll just share a couple more things. I mean, one, this is also from the list of major gifts, and you can see here, it was collected from 1850 to 1854, collected by Dr. Griffith and Anston, and it was all, an amount of $3,000. And so the money that really built the first church and bought the first church lot came from people that we know were, had slaves. And as we already talked about, a number of the original vestry members, some of them had 3 slaves, some of them had 30, but and some of them had none, but there was a lot of slaveholding in our original among our original vestry members. And to me, it's sort of like this is a historical kind of mystery, but to me, I think this is a story that we should really actually tell, in one part because we have names. Second, we know that they were baptized in our parish, these individuals, and to me, I think this is a story in our past that if there's a way for us to look into this, will help us expand our understanding of the origins of St. John's, the first parish, the first people to be baptized here, the first people to be confirmed here, because they're all interconnected and they're all interrelated. And this is a whole thing, like it's written into our records. But if you look at, what was published by the church at the 100th anniversary, the 150th anniversary, the 125th anniversary, none of this is in there. None of this is in there. And to me, in our 175th year, now's the time to start expanding our family history and to really start thinking, okay, we without some of these leaders, without a John Anson, there is no St. John's. Without a Sarah F. Gaines and that incredible bequest that she gave, I probably don't have a job today. I mean, every one of us stands in the legacy of these leaders, both the good that they did, which we rightly celebrate and honor, but also the ill that they did, which is also part of our inheritance. You inherit the good and the bad. And so I don't know. No.
Well, I think it's really exciting, and I'm very proud of our parish for having the courage to be thinking and talking about this. And I hope we have both the courage and the will to continue on and do the work.
I hope so too.
Well, should we close out tonight in this great conversation? Thank you so much, Emily. Thank you, Mary Catherine. Do we want to close out with prayer tonight?
Sure. I'm happy to lead it. It's actually a meditation from Parker Palmer. He says, if we are to stand and act with hope in the tragic gap and do it for the long haul, we cannot settle for mere effectiveness as the ultimate measure of our failure or success. Yes, we want to be effective in pursuit of important goals, but we must judge ourselves by a higher standard than effectiveness, the standard called faithfulness. Are we faithful to the eternal conversation of the human race, to speaking and listening in a way that takes us closer to truth? Are we faithful to the call of courage that summons us to witness to the common good, even against great odds? When faithfulness is our standard, we are more likely to sustain our engagement with tasks that will never end, doing justice, loving mercy, and calling the beloved community into being. Gracious God, help us in our faithfulness. Amen.
Amen. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mary Catherine.
Thanks for inviting me.